Abigail Carter slammed her last 20 cents on that kitchen counter and pressed both hands flat against the cold iron stove until her knuckles turned white. 7 men were waiting outside that door. Hungry, silent, watching. Behind her stood nothing but a half-empty flour sack, a pinch of salt, and a kitchen so cold she could see her own breath. She had been called too large, too plain, too broken to matter her entire life. But tonight, in this abandoned Montana kitchen, Abigail Carter was going to prove every single one of them wrong. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The flour sack hit the wooden table with a hollow thud, and Abigail stood there listening to that sound like it was the last honest thing left in the world. She was 31 years old, and she had nothing. Not a husband. Not a family name that meant anything in this territory. Not a single person on God's green earth who was expecting her to succeed tonight. She had calloused hands and a back that ached from years of bending over other people's stoves, and she had this, a half-empty flour sack, a handful of salt wrapped in a square of cloth, and a cast-iron stove so cold it felt like touching a gravestone. Outside the kitchen door, she could hear them. 7 ranch hands, just back from a full day under the Montana summer sun, boots scraping against the porch boards, voices low and tired and already suspicious. She heard one of them, big voice, older man, say it plain as daylight. "I give her an hour before she walks out the same door she walked in." Another one laughed, short, mean, the kind of laugh that had followed Abigail Carter for most of her adult life. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at that sound a long time ago. What she did was pull open every cabinet in that kitchen, one by one, slow and deliberate, the way a woman does when she is taking inventory of exactly what kind of war she is walking into. The first cabinet held 3 tins, all empty. The second held a rusted ladle and a cloth so old it crumbled when she touched it. The third held nothing at all, except the smell of something that used to be there and wasn't anymore. "Lord," she said quietly, to no one in particular, "you really did want to test me tonight." She moved through the kitchen the way she had moved through every hard thing in her life, without panic, without tears, without any of the noise that people expected from a woman in her situation. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders and full through the hips, and she had spent so many years being told that her body made her less that she had eventually stopped hearing it the way people meant it. She heard it as sound, the way you hear wind. It moved through her, and then it was gone. What was not gone was the hunger of 7 men outside that door. That was real. That was her problem to solve. She got down on her hands and knees and opened the low cabinet beneath the dry sink, and that was where she found the first thing that mattered. A cloth sack, tied at the top, shoved so far back against the wall she had to stretch her arm to reach it. She pulled it free and untied the string and pressed her face close in the dim light. Dried beans. Not many, but enough. She sat back on her heels and held that sack against her chest like it was something precious, because right then it was. "All right," she said. "All right." She stood up, pressed her hands against the small of her back, and started looking again. A woman who has spent her life being told she has nothing learns to look harder than anyone else. She finds the things that get overlooked because she has been overlooked her entire life, and she knows exactly where those things hide. Behind a stack of empty grain sacks in the corner, she found 4 jars of preserved vegetables, green beans, onions, something that might have been carrots once. The wax seals were still intact. She held the first jar up to the fading light from the window and turned it slowly. Still good. She set them on the table beside the flour sack. Inventory. She was building an inventory. She went back to looking. In the lean-to storage room attached to the back of the kitchen, the one with the broken latch that swung open when she put her shoulder against the door, she found a small tin of lard, a bundle of dried herbs hanging from a nail, sage, she thought, and maybe thyme, and a crock of something covered in a square of cheesecloth. She lifted the cloth carefully and found a small store of dried cornmeal at the bottom, maybe a cup's worth, not more. She stood in that lean-to for a long moment, looking at what she had assembled in her mind. Flour, salt, dried beans, preserved vegetables, lard, herbs, cornmeal, a stove that was cold but appeared functional. A pot she had noticed hanging above the hearth, heavy and black, and older than anyone currently living on this property. It wasn't a feast, but it was a beginning. She went back into the kitchen, filled the big pot from the water barrel near the door, and began building a fire in the stove. Her hands moved quickly, finding the rhythm that years of kitchen work had put into her muscle and bone, the rhythm she didn't have to think about anymore because it lived in her fingers. Kindling first. Paper from the pile on the shelf. Strike the match. The first match broke. She struck the second one. The flame caught. She held her breath until the kindling took, until the small orange light grew steady and real, and then she exhaled and set the pot on the stove and dropped the dried beans into the cold water to begin the long work of softening. She was so focused on the fire that she didn't hear the kitchen door open. "You're still here." The voice was low, flat. Not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. She turned and found a man standing in the doorway. Tall, lean, somewhere past 40, with the kind of face that had spent most of its life being weathered by something harder than sun and wind. He wore a dark coat and held his hat in both hands, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite know what to make of. Nathan Walker. She recognized him from the brief, uncomfortable meeting they'd had 2 hours earlier when she'd arrived, when he'd shaken her hand without quite meeting her eyes and told her the kitchen was through the back and the men would be in by sundown, and he trusted she could manage. She had said yes. She had not told him what she'd found when she got to the kitchen, because that wasn't the kind of thing you announced. You either managed or you didn't, and Abigail Carter had spent 31 years managing. "I said I could do the job," she told him. "I aim to do it." Nathan looked at the table, at the flour and the beans and the jars lined up in a row. Something moved behind his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. "The men are expecting a proper supper," he said. "They'll have one." He looked at the jars again. "With this." It was not quite a question and not quite a challenge. It sat somewhere in between. Abigail turned back to the stove and checked the fire. Even. Good. She adjusted the pot. "Mr. Walker," she said, not turning around. "I grew up cooking for 12 people on less than this. I cooked my first full Sunday dinner when I was 9 years old because my mother was sick and my father didn't know what a kitchen was for. I have fed harvest crews in sick rooms and households where the money ran out on Tuesday and payday wasn't until Friday." She finally turned and looked at him directly. "So yes, with this, your men will eat tonight." Nathan Walker stood there for a moment. Then he put his hat back on his head. "Sundown," he said. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked back out, and Abigail turned back to the stove, and that was the whole conversation. She worked through the next 2 hours with the single-minded focus of someone who has decided there is only one acceptable outcome, and every action from here is in service of that outcome. She opened the jars and added the preserved vegetables to the beans. She rendered the lard in the smaller pan. She mixed the flour and salt and a measure of the lard into a dough, working it with her hands until it came together the way good bread dough does, yielding but not soft, with a certain resistance that meant it would hold. She shaped the dough into rounds and set them in the heavy iron skillet to cook low and slow on the side of the stove while the bean stew built itself in the pot. She added the dried herbs she'd found, the sage first, then what turned out to be rosemary rather than thyme, which was better, she thought. And the smell that began rising from that pot was the smell of something honest, something real. She was stirring the stew when the kitchen door opened again. This time it was not Nathan Walker. It was a boy, or near enough to one, maybe 16, 17, with too much height and not enough weight, and the look of someone who had grown up expecting to be invisible. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving around the kitchen like he was trying to understand how it had changed in the last 2 hours. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Samuel sent me to ask when supper would be ready. He said—" The boy stopped. His eyes had landed on the pot and stayed there. "Is that—" "Is that a stew?" "It is," Abigail said. "A real one?" She looked at him. "What other kind is there?" The boy swallowed. The last cook mostly did salt pork and hardtack. Said it wasn't worth the effort to do more when nobody here noticed the difference. Abigail felt something move through her chest. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli," he said. "Eli Turner." "Well, Eli Turner," she said. "You go tell Samuel supper will be ready in 30 minutes, and you tell him to get those men washed up, because I set a proper table, and I expect it to be sat at properly." Eli stared at her. "You set the table already?" "I set the table first," she said. "That's how you show people you're expecting them." Something happened to that boy's face then. Something small and private that she wasn't sure he even knew was there. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and disappeared out the door. 30 minutes later, she carried the pot and the skillet out to the table in the adjacent room. The long, low-ceilinged room, with the scarred wooden table that could seat 10. She had laid it out earlier. Plates she'd found in the second cabinet, mismatched but clean. Forks and knives that she'd wiped down with the better cloth she'd found folded at the bottom of a drawer. She had put a candle in the center. Not a fancy candle, just a stub in a tin holder. But it was lit, and it was there. The men came in from the porch in a loose group. The older one, Samuel Brooks, she'd learned, an ex-army man who'd been on this ranch longer than anyone else. Coming in first with that same look she'd seen on Eli's face, that combination of wariness and something that might have been hope if hope had learned to protect itself. Behind him came the others, and she watched them clock the table the same way. The recognition that someone had thought about whether they were comfortable, whether they had enough light, whether the plates were placed with intention or just thrown down. These were men who were used to being fed like livestock and not like people. She watched Samuel Brooks stop at his chair and just stand there for a moment, looking at the plate in front of him. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed from what she'd heard through the door. "This is—" He stopped and cleared his throat. "When's the last time I saw a candle on this table?" he said, more to himself than to her. "Sit down," she told him. Not unkindly. "Before it gets cold." She served the stew herself, moving around the table with the heavy pot, filling each bowl to the same level, making sure the bread was within reach of every man before she set the skillet down. She did not sit. She never sat until everyone else was eating. That was the rule she'd learned in the first kitchen she'd worked in, and it was the rule she'd kept ever since. The first bite Samuel Brooks took, he set his spoon down and looked up at her. "I haven't had food that tasted like this," he said, "since—" He stopped again. "Since my mother was alive, ma'am." "You eat," she said. "Don't let it cool." She moved back to this kitchen doorway and watched them eat, the way she always watched. Not intrusively, but the way a person watches something they are responsible for. She watched the tension in those shoulders drop. She watched the conversation start, slow at first, then picking up the way a fire does when it finally catches good wood. She watched Eli Turner, sitting at the far end of the table, eating with the careful focus of a boy who was trying to make a meal last as long as possible, because he was not entirely sure when the next one would be this good. She was still watching when Nathan Walker appeared in the far doorway. He stood there the way he had stood in her kitchen doorway. Quiet, one hand resting against the frame, watching his men the way she was watching them. She could not see his face clearly from across the room, but she could see the way his body was arranged, and she could see that something in it was different from this afternoon. Less closed, less like a door that had been locked from the inside. He looked across the room and found her watching him. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the kitchen to start the cleaning, because the meal was done and the work was not. And Abigail Carter had never been the kind of woman who waited to be noticed. She was halfway through washing the pot when she heard the chair scrape back at the far end of the table, and then footsteps, and then Nathan Walker was standing in the kitchen doorway. She kept washing. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Miss," she said. "It's Miss Carter." A pause. "Miss Carter." She waited. "The men—" He stopped, tried again. "They haven't eaten like that since—" He didn't finish the sentence. "It's been a long time," he said finally. She set the pot down and turned to look at him. "How long since you had a proper cook?" He thought about it. 8 months, maybe 9. "And before that?" Something changed in his face. "My wife cooked," he said. Before. Before. She understood that word, the way she understood cold stoves and empty cabinets, as something that used to hold something and now held only its absence. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded once. The way men do when they've been given something they don't have the vocabulary for. "The advertisement said the position paid $15 a month," Abigail said, because she had learned that practicality was the kindest thing you could offer a man who had gotten too close to an honest emotion. "Plus room and board." "That's right." "Then we have an arrangement." She picked up the pot again. "Breakfast is at 6. I'll need a full inventory of your stores tomorrow morning, so I know what I'm working with." Nathan Walker stood in that doorway for another moment, looking at her the way he'd looked at the table earlier, like he was trying to understand how a room had changed while he wasn't paying attention. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." He left. Abigail finished the washing and put the pot back on its hook above the hearth and stood in the center of that kitchen for a moment, looking at what she'd made it into in a single evening. The fire in the stove had settled to a steady glow. The counter was clean. The shelves held what little they held, but it was organized now, inventoried, accounted for. The room smelled of rosemary and wood smoke and the faint sweet ghost of bread. It smelled like a place where someone lived. She put her hands on the back of the nearest chair and leaned her weight into it, just for a moment. Her feet ached. Her back ached. She was tired in the way that only honest work makes you tired, which is different from the tiredness of despair. Heavier in the body, but lighter somewhere else. She had done what she said she would do. Tomorrow, there would be more to do. A full inventory. A supply run, probably. Conversations with Nathan Walker about what the ranch actually needed versus what he'd been getting by on. Conversations with Samuel Brooks about the men's preferences and their schedules. A proper look at that lean-to in the daylight to see if there was anything else hiding back there in the shadows. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she had taken a cold stove and an empty kitchen and a flour sack with not much left in it, and she had fed 7 hungry men, and she had set a table with a candle in the center, and somewhere in that long, low-ceilinged room, Eli Turner had eaten a bowl of stew slowly enough to mean something. She pushed herself upright, straightened her back, and picked up the lamp. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana night had come in full and dark and enormous, the way it does out here where there's nothing between you and the sky to soften it. She could see stars through the glass, more than she'd ever seen growing up in Ohio, more than she thought you could count if you had your whole life to try. She thought about what Samuel Brooks had said. "Since my mother was alive." She thought about the look on Eli Turner's face when he'd realized there was a real stew on the stove. She thought about Nathan Walker standing in that doorway saying the word before, like it was the heaviest word in the English language. She carried the lamp to the small back room that would be her quarters, barely big enough for the cot and the small dresser inside it. And she sat down on the edge of the cot and unlaced her boots, one at a time, setting them neatly beside the door. All her life, people had looked at her and decided what she was before she had the chance to show them. They saw her size and they made up their minds. They saw her plain face and her worn clothing and her lack of a husband or a family name that meant anything, and they made up their minds about all of that too. She had walked into 100 rooms and felt the air change the moment people saw her, felt the particular quality of their attention, that mixture of dismissal and pity that she had learned to move through like weather. But tonight, in that kitchen, not a single thing that happened had anything to do with how she looked. It had everything to do with what she did. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. The creak of boards, the distant low of cattle, the wind moving through whatever spaces it found. And she felt something she had almost stopped believing she would feel again. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But the first solid edge of something that happiness could eventually be built on. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was going to ask a great deal of her. She had always been better at great deals than people expected. The lamp burned low in the corner, and outside the Montana sky burned bright with every star it had, and in the kitchen just down the short hall, the iron stove held its warmth long into the cold night, the way a good stove does, the way some things do when you have finally given them enough reason to. The next morning came fast and cold, the way Montana mornings do in summer, when the night has had its way with the temperature and the sun hasn't yet made up its mind about the day. Abigail was already in the kitchen when the first man stirred. She had been up since 5, which was the hour she had trained herself to rise back when she was 16, and working her first real kitchen job in Dayton, Ohio, for a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who believed that a cook who wasn't working before sunrise wasn't really working at all. Abigail had carried that habit the way she carried most things, quietly, without complaint, as a simple fact of who she was. She had the fire going. She had found cornmeal in the lean-to that she hadn't fully assessed in the dim light the night before, more than she'd thought, a full 2-pound sack pushed behind a crate in the far corner. And she was standing at the stove working the first batch of cornbread in the iron skillet, when she heard boots on the porch boards and the kitchen door came open. It was Samuel Brooks. He stopped just inside the door, the same way he had stopped the night before, but this time his eyes went straight to the stove, and something in his face did something she recognized. That involuntary shift of a man who has braced himself for disappointment, and instead gotten something else. "You're cooking," he said. "I am," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the table. He put his hat on the chair beside him. He folded his hands in front of him and watched her work, and after a moment he said, "I figured last night might have been, I don't know, a one-time thing." She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "Why would it be a one-time thing?" He shrugged. A careful shrug, the kind men do when they're embarrassed to explain something they feel. "Last few cooks we had. They'd do something decent the first night, trying to impress. Then it went downhill from there." "How many cooks have you had? Since Mrs. Walker passed?" He thought about it. 4, not counting you." She turned back to the cornbread. "How'd they leave?" "2 quit. One got hired away by a ranch up north paying better wages. And the last one—" He stopped. "The last one what?" "Packed up in the middle of the night," Samuel said. "Just gone. Didn't even take all her things. Left a note on the table, said she was sorry but she couldn't do it anymore." Abigail flipped the cornbread in the skillet, watching the color on the bottom. Even. Good. "Do it any more," she said. What did she mean by that? Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I think she meant the quiet," he said finally. "This ranch got real quiet after Mrs. Walker died. Mr. Walker, he stopped talking much. The men followed his lead. And quiet does something to a person after a while, especially a woman alone in a kitchen all day." Abigail did not say anything to that. She thought about it while she worked the skillet, turned the idea over the way she turned the cornbread, carefully, giving it the attention it deserved. "How long ago did she pass?" she asked. "Mrs. Walker." 3 years this past April." 3 years. She calculated that against the silence she'd felt the night before in the long dining room, against the look on Nathan Walker's face when he'd said the word before, like it was something he carried in his chest and hadn't put down yet. "He loved her," she said. It wasn't a question. "Like breathing," Samuel said simply. She took the cornbread off the heat and started on the eggs she'd collected from the henhouse at first light, 14 of them, more than she'd expected, which meant the chickens were being underfed but not neglected, which told her something about the state of this ranch that she filed away for later. The other men came in by 1s and 2s over the next 20 minutes, each of them stopping in that same doorway moment, that flash of surprised recalibration, before sitting down. She fed them eggs and cornbread and strong black coffee, and she watched them eat the way she always watched, taking note of who ate fast because they were used to food disappearing before they got enough, and who ate slow because they'd learned to make good things last, and who didn't talk in the morning and who needed to. Eli Turner was the last one in. He came through the door with his hair still damp and his shirt buttoned wrong. One button off, the collar uneven. And he sat at the far end of the table the way he always seemed to sit, at the place farthest from the center of things, as if he'd long ago decided that the edges were safer than the middle. Abigail set a plate in front of him without comment. He looked up at her. "Thank you, ma'am. Your shirt's buttoned wrong," she said quietly, moving on before he could be embarrassed about it. She heard him look down. She heard the small sound of him fixing it. She did not turn around. Nathan Walker did not come to breakfast. She had set a place for him at the head of the table, had it ready, and he didn't come. When Samuel was on his second cup of coffee and the others were pushing back their chairs and heading for the door, she asked him, "Does he eat in the mornings?" Samuel wrapped both hands around his mug. "He eats when he remembers to." She looked at the untouched plate at the head of the table. "Where is he?" "Barn, probably. Or the east fence line. He's up before any of us. Always has been. But since—" Samuel stopped. "He just moves around a lot in the morning, like he's trying to keep ahead of something." She took the plate from the head of the table, covered it with a cloth, and set it in the warming oven. "He'll eat when he comes in," she said. Samuel watched her do it, and something in his face shifted. Something quiet and particular that she didn't ask him about because it felt private, like watching a man remember something he'd almost let himself forget. The morning inventory took her 2 hours. She went through every cabinet, every shelf, the full lean-to, the root cellar she found through a trap door in the kitchen floor that nobody had mentioned, and the small smokehouse attached to the north side of the barn. She wrote everything down on a sheet of paper she'd found in the kitchen drawer, using the stub of a pencil she'd brought in her coat pocket, because she had learned a long time ago that a pencil in your own pocket was worth more than any number of things you were counting on finding. The root cellar surprised her. It held more than she'd expected. Cured ham, several crocks of pickled things, a dozen jars of put-up tomatoes, a crate of apples that were mostly still good. Someone had stocked it at some point, and then simply stopped going down there. She stood in the low space with the lamp and looked at what was around her and felt the particular feeling of finding something valuable in a place everyone had given up on. She went through the whole list when she came back up. Reorganized it, prioritized, made a second list of what she needed from town. She was writing the second list when Nathan Walker came in the back door. He was carrying a piece of fence wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other, and he had the look of a man who had been working hard since before the sun got serious about the day. He stopped when he saw her at the table with her papers. "Miss Carter, your breakfast is in the warming oven," she said without looking up. A pause. "I don't usually—" "I know," she kept writing. "It's there when you want it." She heard him set the wire and the pliers down on the counter. She heard him go to the warming oven. She heard the sound of the cloth being lifted and the plate being taken out. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat sideways in the chair nearest the counter, close to where she was writing, and he ate standing up style, even though he was sitting down. Quick, efficient bites, a man refueling rather than eating. She let him eat. Then she said, "I found your root cellar." He stopped chewing. "Nobody told me it was there," she said. "I found the trapdoor myself. You've got cured ham and pickled vegetables and a dozen jars of put-up tomatoes and a crate of apples. Why didn't anyone tell me about the root cellar?" Nathan Walker was quiet for a moment. "I forgot it was there," he said finally. She looked up at him then. He said it so plainly that she understood it wasn't laziness or neglect. It was the specific kind of forgetting that comes from grief. The way sorrow doesn't just take the person you lost, but takes everything that was connected to them, until you wake up one day and realize you've been living in a house with rooms you stopped going into. "Your wife," she said. Not a question. He looked at his plate. She put those things up, every fall. She had a whole system. He stopped. "After she was gone, I didn't go down there." Abigail looked back at her list. "Well," she said carefully, "it's there, and it's still good, most of it. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Use whatever you need. I intend to, but I want to be straight with you about what I found, so there's no confusion later about where things came from or where they went." He looked at her. The way he'd looked at her in the kitchen doorway the night before. That same quality of attention, slightly tilted, like a man trying to figure out the angle of something. "All right," he said. "I also need to go to town. There are things we're short on. Flour mainly, salt, baking powder. I can make a list. I'll take you," he said. That surprised her. She had expected him to send one of the ranch hands. "You don't need to. I know the merchant," he said. "He'll give us a better price if I'm there." He pushed back from the table and stood up. "Tomorrow morning, that all right?" "That's fine," she said. He picked up his plate and set it in the dry sink. It was such a small thing, a man putting his own plate away. But she had worked in enough houses to know it wasn't something you could take for granted. "Thank you for breakfast," he said. "I didn't expect—" He stopped. "I made enough," she said simply. He nodded and picked up his fence wire and his pliers and went back out the door, and Abigail sat at the table for a moment after he was gone, looking at the place he'd been sitting. 3 years since his wife died. A root cellar full of things she'd put up herself, untouched for 3 years because the grief of it was too heavy to carry down those stairs. A ranch that was still physically functioning, but had quietly come apart in every way that didn't show on a ledger. She looked at her list. She added, "Check smokehouse hinges, they're coming loose." She added, "Find out what Eli Turner's situation is." She folded the list and put it in her apron pocket and went to start the soup for the midday meal. The ride to town the next morning was the first time Abigail had been anywhere near the town of Holt in daylight. She had come in on the stage from Billings in the early evening 2 days ago, arriving at Walker Ranch just before supper and not seeing much of anything on the way. Now, sitting up on the wagon bench beside Nathan Walker as he drove the 2 horses down the main road, she got her first real look at what kind of place she'd landed in. Holt, Montana was the kind of town that had bigger opinions of itself than its size justified. One main street, a general store, a livery, a small hotel, 3 saloons, a church with a bell that needed repair, and a scattering of houses behind everything like they'd been set there as an afterthought. The whole thing looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen or for the railroad to pass through and give it an excuse to become real. She was aware of the town the moment the wagon turned onto the main street. Not aware of the town exactly. Aware of the town looking at her. She had felt this her entire life. The particular quality of other people's attention when they were assessing you and finding you wanting. She felt it in the way a woman on the wooden sidewalk slowed her walk and turned to watch the wagon pass. She felt it in the cluster of men near the livery who stopped talking to look. She felt it, most particularly, in the way the merchant's wife, a thin woman with precise hair, appeared in the doorway of the general store as they pulled up, looked at Abigail, and then looked at Nathan Walker with an expression that was doing a great deal of work. Nathan didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He set the brake, climbed down, and came around to Abigail's side of the wagon. She was already climbing down herself. She had never been the kind of woman who waited to be helped. But he offered his hand anyway, and she took it briefly, just long enough to make the step. And then she was on the ground, and the merchant's wife was still in the doorway. "Nathan," the woman said. Her eyes moved to Abigail and then back. "I didn't know you were coming in today." "Morning, Mrs. Caulfield," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it was at the ranch, flat and even and revealing nothing. "This is Miss Carter. She's the new cook out at the ranch. We need to settle some accounts and pick up some supplies." Mrs. Caulfield's eyes moved back to Abigail. All the way down, all the way back up. The kind of look that does what it means to do without any words attached to it. "Of course," she said. Smiling now, but the smile sitting above something that wasn't a smile. "Welcome to Holt, Miss Carter." "Thank you," Abigail said. Inside the store, Nathan went to speak with Caulfield about the account, and Abigail moved through the aisles with her list, pulling things as she found them. Flour, salt, baking powder, dried apples, a tin of molasses, 2 pounds of coffee beans, a sack of sugar. She was hefting the flour sack when she became aware of a conversation happening in the back corner of the store. 2 women. Their voices were low, the way women's voices are when they want to be heard by a specific person without being heard by everyone. Can't imagine what Nathan is thinking. He's not thinking, that's the trouble. He never has been, not since Margaret died. She's the new cook? She can barely. A pause waited with something Abigail knew very well. Well, you know, I know. Abigail set the flour sack on the counter and moved to the next item on her list. She could feel her face doing something. A kind of controlled stillness she'd cultivated over decades of being in rooms where people said things like this. Her face went quiet. The rest of her kept working. Someone ought to say something to him, the first woman said. It doesn't look right. A man like Nathan, letting a woman like that have run of his house. Abigail picked up the baking powder. She put it on the counter. Who's going to say it? The second woman said. You know how he is. He'll look at you like you've said something in another language and walk away. A third voice joined from somewhere Abigail couldn't see. Lower. More careful. She cooked supper 2 nights ago. Samuel Brooks told my husband it was the best meal he'd had since he couldn't remember when. A silence. Samuel Brooks, the first woman said, with the particular inflection of a person dismissing something they don't want to engage with. Well, the third voice said quietly. The proof's in the eating, I'd say. Abigail set the molasses on the counter. She had everything on her list. She went and found Nathan Walker at the back of the store, standing with Caulfield over the account book, and she said quietly, I have everything. Whenever you're ready. He looked at her. Something in her face, or something in the way she was standing, made him look at her for a moment longer than he normally did. Then he looked back at Caulfield and said, We'll take it all. On the ride back, they didn't talk for the first mile. She was watching the road. He was watching the horses. The wagon moved through the morning at an easy pace, and the wind came across the grass from the west, and it was actually pleasant. The kind of morning that made you understand why people came to this country, even though it was hard. Then he said, without preamble, I know what they say about things out at the ranch. She waited. About the way it's run. About the state of things. After Margaret. He stopped. People have opinions. People always have opinions, she said. Some of them are saying... He stopped again. Started differently. Mrs. Caulfield has made it her business to comment on my affairs since before I had a ranch to run. She and Margaret didn't get on. That surprised her. She looked at him. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Margaret wasn't from around here. She came from Pennsylvania. Different kind of woman than what Holt was used to. Didn't particularly care what people thought of her. Abigail looked back at the road. She sounds like someone worth knowing, she said. Nathan Walker didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she was the best person I ever met. It sat there between them on the wagon bench, that sentence, and Abigail did not try to do anything with it. You didn't do anything with a sentence like that. You just let it be what it was. After a while, she said, Can I ask you something about the ranch? You can ask. The finances, she said. Not to pry. But from what I can see, and from what Samuel's told me, it seems like there are places where things aren't being tracked the way they should be. The supplies, the store accounts, little things that add up. She chose her words carefully. Is the ranch? Are things steady? He didn't answer right away. She watched his hands on the reins, the way they tightened slightly, then relaxed deliberately, like a man choosing his response from inside. It's not what it was, he said. What would it take to get it back to what it was? Another pause. Longer. More than what I've got, maybe. Or maybe just a different way of looking at what you've already got, she said. He looked at her then. Sideways, the kind of look you give something when you're not sure whether it's true or whether you want it to be. She looked back at the road. I found things in your root cellar that you forgot existed, she said simply. And I made a meal out of what everyone else thought was an empty kitchen. I'm not saying I can fix what's wrong with the ranch accounts. I'm saying I know what it looks like when things are being looked at wrong. He was quiet the rest of the way back. But when they pulled into the yard and he set the brake and came around to help her down with the supplies, he said, After supper tonight, bring your pencil. She looked at him. The account books, he said. If you want to look at them, We can look at them." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right." She lifted the flour sack from the wagon bed and carried it herself toward the kitchen. And behind her she heard Nathan Walker make a sound, quiet, barely there, that might have been the beginning of something he'd been holding back for a long time. The supper that night was the second full meal she had cooked at Walker Ranch, and it was better than the first. She made the ham from the root cellar, sliced thick and cooked slow in the big iron pan with a little of the molasses from town and some of the dried apple. And she made a pot of beans with tomatoes from the put-up jars and the dried herbs from the lean-to. And she made proper biscuits with the new flour and baking powder, the kind that came out of the oven gold on top and pulling apart in layers. The kind that people who grew up eating real biscuits sometimes close their eyes when they eat the first one. Samuel Brooks closed his eyes. She saw it happen and looked away because it felt private. Eli Turner took a second biscuit before the first one was entirely gone, stopped himself, looked at her, and she said, "There's enough." And he took the second one without looking guilty. That was the moment she decided she needed to know more about Eli Turner. She found her chance later, after supper, while the other men went to the bunkhouse and Nathan went to get the account books. Eli had lingered in the dining room, not quite sure what to do with himself, stacking plates in the way of someone who wants to help but doesn't know if he's allowed. "Leave those," she said from the kitchen doorway. "I'll get them. Come talk to me while I clean up." He came into the kitchen and stood near the counter, not quite at ease, the way teenage boys stand when they've been invited somewhere and aren't sure they belong there. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, filling the wash basin. 7 months, he said. "And before Walker Ranch?" "The Morrison Spread, up near Billings. Before that, a mining camp outside of Helena." He said it the way people list things they've survived rather than things they've done. "I was there about 4 months. It was..." He paused. "It wasn't good." "How old are you, Eli?" 17. She washed a plate and set it to dry. "And your family?" The silence that followed that question was its own complete answer. She had learned to read silences the way other people read words, their weight, their shape, what they were protecting. "I see," she said simply. "My mother died when I was 12, he said then, like he'd decided to say it before she had to figure it out. "Fever. My father took off before that, so..." He shrugged, the careful shrug again. "I've been working since I was 13. She washed another plate. "You work hard," she said. "I've seen it." He looked up from wherever he'd been looking. "You noticed?" "I notice everything," she said. It wasn't boasting, it was just true. "You're the first one up in the morning and the last one to stop at night. And you do twice the work of some of the older men without complaining about it. And you've been eating like someone who never knows when the next good meal is coming." She set the plate down and looked at him. "Which is something I understand, for the record." He stared at her. "You? I grew up in a house where money was irregular," she said. "There were years when a good meal was something you planned for and hoped for and sometimes just did without." She picked up the next plate. "I know what it is to eat with one eye on whether there'll be enough." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You cook like you never want anyone to feel that way." She stopped washing. It was such a precise thing to say. Such an accurate thing. She hadn't expected it from a 17-year-old boy who stood sideways in rooms like he was trying to take up less space. She turned and looked at him. "That is exactly right," she said. "That is exactly what I'm trying to do." Something in Eli Turner's face did something complicated then. Something that moved through his eyes like a wave that came up fast and then was gone. The kind of thing that happens when a person suddenly understands that they have been seen correctly after a very long time of being looked at wrong. He nodded once. "Well," he said, "you're doing it." She turned back to the wash basin. "Good," she said. "Now go get some sleep. You'll wear yourself out being up at all hours." He headed for the door, stopped, turned back. "Miss Carter." "What?" "That was the best biscuit I've ever eaten in my life." She didn't turn around. "Go to bed, Eli." She heard him laugh. Small, private, real. And then he was gone, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water and the low conversation of the stove fire. She was still washing up when Nathan came in with the account books. He set them on the table and pulled out the chair across from where she usually sat, and they spent the next 2 hours going through numbers together under the lamplight, her pencil moving across the paper, her voice asking careful questions, his voice answering them more honestly than she'd expected. The picture that emerged from those books was not good. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet. But it was the kind of not good that becomes catastrophic if you wait long enough, if you keep not looking at it the way Nathan had been not looking at it for 3 years. She found 3 places where money was going out without clear accounting. She found a debt that had been rolling over without being addressed. She found a pattern of purchasing that made sense in the year his wife died, when he clearly hadn't been paying attention to any of it, and had just continued on momentum since then, like a clock still running in a stopped room. She didn't say any of this in a way designed to make him feel bad. She laid it out the way she laid out Emil, clearly, practically, with the implicit message that here was the situation, and here was what could be done about it. At the end, Nathan Walker sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "I've been running blind," he said. "You've been grieving," she said. "Those are different things, even when they look the same." He looked at her. "But you're right," she said. "The numbers need tending. There are things here that can be fixed if you start now." She tapped the paper with her pencil. "This supply account, for instance. If you renegotiate the terms with Caulfield and pay down the back portion, the monthly cost drops and you're not paying interest. That alone. You know about interest terms?" She looked at him steadily. "I know about a lot of things, Mr. Walker. People tend not to find that out because they don't think to ask." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you have been, do you think? If things had been different, if you'd had, I don't know, a different start?" It was such an unexpected question that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. She looked at the paper in front of her, at the numbers she'd been working with. She thought about it honestly, the way he'd asked it honestly. "A teacher, maybe," she said. "Or something to do with numbers, accounting. Something where being precise and careful and thorough mattered." She paused. "Or maybe exactly this. Maybe this is it, and the difference is just whether anyone respects you for it." Nathan Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I respect you for it." It was said simply, without performance, without the social grease that men usually apply to compliments. Just a plain statement of fact. She looked back at the account book. "Then we understand each other," she said. She closed the book and gathered her papers, and he picked up the lamp from the center of the table to light her way back to her room, which was something he hadn't done before, and which neither of them made a point of. She lay down on her cot later that night and stared at the ceiling again, the way she had the first night. But the feeling in her chest was different now. Less like finding solid ground for the first time. More like beginning to understand the shape of the land she was standing on. She thought about the 2 women in Caulfield's store. She thought about Mrs. Caulfield's smile that sat above something that wasn't a smile. She thought about the way the town had watched the wagon as they came down the main street. She thought about Nathan Walker saying, "I respect you for it," plain as weather, and meaning every word. She thought about Eli Turner saying you cook like you never want anyone to feel that way. There was something growing on this ranch. Something small and stubborn, and not fully visible yet. The way the first green things come up in early spring, before anyone agrees it's time for them. Pushing through in the dark, reaching for a light they can feel but can't yet see. She could feel it too. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the cot. The rough-cut boards of this room that was barely large enough to hold her. In this ranch house that was barely holding itself together. In this town that had already decided what it thought of her. And she pressed her hand there until she could feel the solidity of it. It was real. All of it was real. And she had been building real things out of nothing for as long as she could remember. So she closed her eyes and let the sleep come. And outside, the Montana night did what it always did. Held everything in its enormous dark and waited for morning. 3 weeks into her time at Walker Ranch, Abigail had learned the rhythm of the place the way you learn a person. Not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing something the one before had kept hidden. She had learned that Samuel Brooks woke at 4:30 every morning without fail, and sat on the porch for 20 minutes before he did anything else. Just sitting, just breathing, like a man who needed to remind himself that the day was worth entering. She had learned that the youngest ranch hand besides Eli, a freckled boy from Kansas named Pete Darrow, was terrified of the horse in the third stall, but would never admit it, and went the long way around the barn every single morning to avoid the confrontation. She had learned that the two Mexican brothers who worked the east pasture, Diego and Rafael Reyes, had been sending money home to their mother in Sonora every month without fail for 6 years, and that they ate whatever she put in front of them with a gratitude so complete it sometimes made her throat tight. She had learned Nathan Walker's silences. Which ones meant he was thinking, and which ones meant he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere past 3 years ago, in a room she couldn't follow him into. She had also learned something about the town of Holt, Montana, that she hadn't expected. Holt was watching her, not the way a town watches a stranger, that fades after a few weeks, once the novelty wears off and people go back to their own business. This was different. This was the specific, focused attention of a community that had decided it had an opinion about something and was waiting to see whether it would be proven right. She felt it on the 2 other occasions she'd been into town with Nathan. She felt it in the way women moved their conversations indoors when the Walker wagon appeared on the main street. She felt it in the deliberate way Caulfield's wife managed to be present every single time without quite seeming to have arranged it, her eyes doing their thorough work and her mouth doing its careful smiling. She felt it most sharply on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after she'd arrived, when she walked into the general store alone. Nathan had sent her with a list and the account book, and found herself face to face with a woman she had not yet met. The woman was standing at the fabric counter. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the way that signals money without screaming it, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of being looked at and deciding what that meant. She had a face that had been beautiful when she was young and was handsome now in a more interesting way, all angles and intention. She turned when Abigail came in and looked at her with the direct frankness of someone who had decided in advance not to pretend. "You're the woman Nathan Walker hired," she said. It wasn't a question, so Abigail didn't answer it like one. "I'm Abigail Carter," she said. "And you are?" "Eleanor Voss." The woman watched her. "My husband owns the bank." Abigail moved to the counter with her list. "Good morning, Mrs. Voss." "I'll be direct with you," Eleanor Voss said, and there was something in her voice that separated her from the Mrs. Caulfields of the world, something that sounded like she meant what she said, rather than what she didn't say. "There is talk in this town about you and Nathan Walker. I expect you know that." "I'm aware people have opinions," Abigail said. "They're saying he's lost his judgment, that a man like Nathan, with a ranch like that, shouldn't have—" Eleanor paused. "Shouldn't have made the choices he's made." Abigail set her list on the counter and looked at Eleanor Voss fully. "And what do you think, Mrs. Voss?" Eleanor looked back at her with the same directness. "I think Nathan Walker hasn't eaten a proper meal, or laughed out loud, or shown up to a town meeting with any color in his face in 3 years, she said. "And Samuel Brooks told my husband last week that the ranch hands have started singing in the bunkhouse again. First time in 2 years. She paused. "So whatever you're doing out there, Miss Carter, I'd say it's working." Abigail held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me that." Eleanor Voss nodded once. "Watch yourself with Dorothea Caulfield," she said quietly. "She has decided not to like you, and she has a great deal of time and very few other interests." She picked up her fabric and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "And Miss Carter, the apple cake. I heard about the apple cake." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Samuel's wife told me." Eleanor's mouth moved toward something that was nearly a smile. "She said it was the finest thing she'd ever put in her mouth. I haven't tasted anything that made Ruth Brooks speak in superlatives, so I thought you should know." She went out the door. Abigail stood at the counter for a moment with a complicated feeling in her chest. Something between gratitude and the particular caution of someone who has been surprised by kindness before and learned not to lean on it too hard. She placed her order and went home. The apple cake had happened the week before, and it had happened because of Eli. She had been in the root cellar reorganizing the remaining stores, bringing up the last of the put-up tomatoes, assessing what was left of the cured ham, when she'd found a second crate of apples pushed against the far wall, ones she hadn't noticed in her first inventory because they'd been stacked behind a barrel. These ones were further along than the first crate, softer, past their best eating, but still good for cooking. Another week and they'd be past even that. She carried them up. Eli had been in the kitchen doorway when she came through the trapdoor, and he'd looked at the apples and said, without thinking, the way people say things when they're caught off guard by memory, "My mother used to make an apple cake." She had stopped and looked at him. He'd looked immediately like he wanted to take the words back. "Sorry," he said. "I don't know why I said that." "What kind?" she asked. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "The apple cake. What kind did she make?" Howe was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to go further into this or pull back, the way a person stands at the edge of a cold river, deciding whether the crossing is worth it. She put cinnamon in it, he said finally. And she'd cook the apples down first on the stove before she put them in the batter. She said that was the secret, cooking them down first, so they weren't raw in the middle. He paused. She made it on Sundays, before church. Abigail looked at the apples in her arms. "I'll make it Sunday," she said. Eli stared at her. "You don't have to. I'm going to use these apples for something before they turn. Might as well be something good." She set the crate on the table. "Go finish what you were doing." He went. But at the door he stopped, and she thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there for a second with his back to her, and then he walked on. She made the cake on Sunday morning, before the men were up, cooking the apples down first the way he'd said, with a little of the sugar and the cinnamon she'd gotten from town, until they were soft and sweet, and the kitchen smelled like something that belonged to a different, warmer kind of life. She made the batter from flour and eggs from the henhouse and the tin of molasses she'd been using sparingly, and she baked it in the heavy round pan she'd found in the back of the cabinet and wondered about. She set it on the table before breakfast. When Eli Turner came in that morning and saw it, he stopped walking. He stood there, and she watched him look at that cake, and she watched something happen in his face that she had no intention of narrating or drawing attention to, because some things are private, even when they happen in a room with other people. He sat down. He ate breakfast like everyone else. After breakfast, she cut the cake and passed it around. When Eli took his first bite, he kept his eyes on the table. His jaw worked. He set his fork down. He picked it up again. And then Samuel Brooks, from the other end of the table, said, "Miss Carter, I don't know where you came from, but I believe God sent you." And the table laughed. All of them, the Reyes brothers, Pete Darrow, the other two ranch hands, Samuel himself. All of them laughing at once, the real kind, the unguarded kind. And Eli Turner looked up from his plate, and he laughed too, quiet but real. And the dining room sounded like a room that had people in it again. Nathan Walker had not been at breakfast that morning. He'd been at the far fence line since before sunrise, working on a section that had come down in the night. He came in mid-morning, when the table was cleared and the other men were gone, and there was one piece of apple cake left on the plate on the counter and a note she'd set beside it that said, "From the root cellar apples. Don't let it go to waste, too." She had not been there to see him find it. She'd been out back pulling the first of the kitchen garden she'd started. She'd asked Nathan 3 days after arriving whether she could use the neglected plot behind the kitchen, and he'd looked at it like he'd forgotten it existed and said yes. And she didn't come back inside until nearly noon. The plate was empty. The note was still there. And under her writing, in a hand she hadn't seen before, careful, a little cramped, the handwriting of someone who didn't do it often, he had written 3 words. It was good. She stood there and read those 3 words and felt something she couldn't quite name, something that lived in the neighborhood of gratitude without being exactly that, something warmer than professional satisfaction and less complicated than the other things she was careful not to examine too closely. She put the note in her apron pocket and went back to the garden. The thing she had not accounted for, in all her careful attention to the ranch and its people and its rhythms, was Charles Whitman. She heard his name for the first time from Samuel on a Wednesday afternoon when she was bringing cold water out to the men working the south pasture. Samuel came off the fence line to drink and stood beside her with his hat off and his forearm across his brow, and he said, "Whitman's been asking around town again." She handed him the ladle. "Who is Charles Whitman?" Samuel drank. "Businessman out of Billings. He's been wanting to buy this ranch for 2 years. Offered Nathan a price for it twice and been turned down twice." He handed the ladle back. "He's been coming around Holt more often lately, talking to people." "What kind of talking?" Samuel put his hat back on. "The kind that plants ideas," he said. "Making noise about how the Walker Ranch is struggling, how Nathan's not in a state to be running it properly." He paused. "He's not entirely wrong about the state of things, but he's not saying it out of concern, if you take my meaning." She took his meaning very clearly. "Does Nathan know he's been in town?" "Nathan knows Whitman exists. Beyond that." Samuel shrugged. "Mr. Walker doesn't like to think about things that make him angry. He'd rather be out working the land than dealing with men like Whitman." "Someone should tell him," she said. "Probably," Samuel agreed. He didn't volunteer to be that someone, and she understood why. There was a particular kind of conversation that Samuel Brooks would walk directly into, and a particular kind he would walk very carefully around, and conversations that required Nathan Walker to sit still and pay attention to his own vulnerability fell clearly in the second category. She told Nathan herself that evening. After supper, when the men had gone and the kitchen was clean and Nathan was doing what he sometimes did in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking at papers that might have been anything, a habit of presence without purpose. "Samuel told me Charles Whitman has been in Holt," she said. Nathan looked up from his papers. "He says Whitman's been talking to people about the ranch." Nathan's expression did not change on the surface, but something underneath it did. A tightening, a specific kind of stillness that she had learned meant he was controlling something. "Whitman talks," Nathan said. "He's been doing more than talking, from what Samuel says. He's building a case." "A case for what?" "For the ranch not being viable under current management." She said it plainly because she had learned that plain was the only way to say difficult things to Nathan Walker. "He's been planting the idea around town that you're not capable of running it, that the right thing would be to sell." Nathan set his coffee cup down. "He's wrong," he said. "I know he's wrong. The question is whether you're going to do something about it or wait until enough people believe him that it becomes harder to argue." A silence. She watched him work through something behind his eyes. "What would you have me do?" "For a start," she said, sitting down across from him, "I'd have you look at these." She put the papers on the table, the ones she'd been working on for 3 days, the account rebalancing she'd done after going through the books twice more, the supply cost projections, the estimate she'd put together of what the kitchen garden would save on food costs over the next 6 months, the numbers she'd run on the livestock sales that were coming in the fall. "The ranch is not in crisis," she said. "It's been poorly managed for 3 years because you were grieving and nobody around you knew how to tell you that. But the bones are good, the land is good, the men are good. The numbers can be turned around if you address the supply debt and restructure the seasonal contracts." She pushed the papers toward him. "This is not a ranch that should be sold," she said. "This is a ranch that should be fought for." Nathan Walker looked at the papers. He reached out and picked up the first one, and she watched him read. Watched his eyes move across the columns she'd put together. Watched the concentration that came into his face. The particular quality of attention of a man who has always understood numbers even when he'd been letting them go unexamined. "You did all this," he said. "I had time in the evenings," she said. He kept reading. A minute passed, then another. "The garden," he said. "You think it'll actually make this kind of difference on the food costs?" In the first year, no. In the second year, yes. And by the third year, if I expand it the way I'm planning." "Third year," he said. He looked up. "You're planning for 3 years out." She met his gaze. "Is that a problem?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Something complicated and layered that she didn't try to decipher, because some things deserve to be looked at without being named. No, he said quietly. That's not a problem. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Whitman is going to come to you, she said. Maybe soon. You need to be ready. Ready how? Ready with the truth, she said. Ready with numbers. Ready with a plan you can actually articulate so that when he tells you the ranch is failing, you can tell him specifically and accurately why he's wrong. She tapped the papers. This is your answer to Whitman. Nathan looked at the papers again. He was quiet for so long that she almost said something more, but she stopped herself. She had learned when to push and when to let the silence work. Finally, he said, "You know what Margaret would have said about you?" The question came from nowhere. She waited. She would have said... He stopped, looked at the table. She used to say that the most dangerous people in the world were the ones everyone underestimated, because by the time anyone figured out they should pay attention, it was already too late. Abigail was very still. She would have liked you, he said. It came out quiet, almost private, like something he'd been thinking for a while and had just decided to say. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with the feeling it put in her chest. Warm and complicated and a little frightening, the way something is frightening when it's real rather than imaginary. She looked at the papers. The supply debt, she said. That's the most pressing thing. If you can talk to Caulfield this week, Abigail. He had never used her first name before, not once. She looked up. Not once. She looked up. He was looking at her the way the table looked after she'd set a candle in the center and laid out the plates, like something that had been plain and functional had been made, unexpectedly, into something that meant something. Thank you, he said. It was so simple, so unremarkable on the surface, those two words. But the way he said them was none of those things. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was honest. Then she looked back at the papers and gathered them into a neat pile and stood up. I'll have breakfast ready at 6, she said. You should get some sleep. She went to her room. She lay down on the cot. She pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. She did not examine what she was feeling because she was not yet ready to. The way you don't open a door you haven't decided about yet. She just held the feeling in her chest, like the way she'd held that flour sack on the first night. Carefully, with both hands, knowing that whatever was inside mattered. She was still lying there, not quite asleep, when she heard the sound. It was coming from outside. From the direction of the main road. The sound of a horse moving fast, then stopping hard. Voices. One of them she didn't know, sharp and carrying. The kind of voice that was accustomed to being the loudest in any room. Then Nathan's voice, lower. Controlled in the particular way that meant he was working to keep it that way. She sat up. She heard the unfamiliar voice say, "Can't keep pretending this operation is solvent, Walker. I'm offering you a fair price." And Nathan's voice, cut cleaner. "I told you twice already, Whitman. The answer is no." The answer was no when you were operating on sentiment. The other voice, Whitman, it had to be Whitman, had the flat certainty of a man who had bought a great many things and believed all of them had a price. You're running on empty, and everyone in this county knows it. Take the offer before there's nothing left to... There's everything left. That was Nathan's voice, but different. Harder in a way she hadn't heard before, like something in him had finally found solid ground to stand on. She was on her feet before she'd made a decision about it. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and went out through the kitchen and around to the side of the house where the voices were coming from. And she stepped into the yard and stood there, and Charles Whitman, a broad, well-dressed man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who ate well and traveled first class, turned to look at her. He took her in. The full assessment, head to foot, the way she'd been assessed her whole life, and she watched him decide what she was in about 3 seconds, the way men like him always did. "Who is this?" he said to Nathan. Not to her. To Nathan. "Miss Carter," Nathan said. "She runs the kitchen." "The cook." Whitman's voice carried a very specific weight. "You're the..." He stopped himself, but not far enough. "I've heard about you." "I expect you have," she said. He looked at her with the particular brand of contempt that wealthy men have for things they've decided don't matter. "This is a business conversation, Miss Carter. I think it might be better if you—" "I found your accounting error," she said. He stopped. "In the land survey from 2 years ago," she said. "The one your man filed with the county clerk. There's a discrepancy in the eastern boundary measurement that means the acreage you've been telling people this ranch has is not the acreage it actually has." She paused. "Which means the price you offered is based on incorrect information. Whether that was intentional or not, I couldn't say." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard since she'd arrived in Montana. Whitman stared at her. Nathan stared at her. She stood in the cold night air with her shawl around her shoulders and her feet in her house slippers on the hard ground, and she looked at Charles Whitman with the steady, patient certainty of a woman who has spent her entire life being dismissed and has learned exactly which moment to stop allowing it. "Where did you—" Whitman started. "I've been going through the ranch records," she said. "Thoroughly. It's something I do." Whitman looked at Nathan. "Walker, where exactly did you find this woman?" "She answered an advertisement," Nathan said, and something in his voice, something warm and dry and unmistakably proud, made Abigail feel something in her chest that she was still not ready to examine. "This isn't over," Whitman said. He said it to Nathan, but he was looking at Abigail. "I know it isn't," she said, "but tonight it is." Whitman rode away. The yard was quiet. Nathan Walker stood in the cold air and looked at Abigail Carter, and she stood there and looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "The accounting error, is that real?" "Yes," she said. "I found it 2 days ago. I was going to tell you tomorrow." She paused. "I didn't expect the occasion to present itself tonight." "How bad is it for him?" "Bad enough that any offer he makes is on unstable ground until it's corrected. It buys you time at minimum." She pulled the shawl tighter. "And possibly leverage, if you want to pursue it." Nathan looked at the direction Whitman had ridden in. Then he looked back at her. "You found that," he said. "Going through the records. On your own time." "I told you I was going through the records." "You didn't tell me why." She met his gaze. "Because this ranch deserves to stand," she said simply. "And I don't like bullies." He was quiet for a long moment. The cold came down from the mountains the way it did every evening, settling into the valley like something that had always been there waiting for the sun to leave. And then Nathan Walker did something she had not expected. He laughed, not a polite laugh. Not the careful social sound men make when something mildly amuses them. A real one. Surprised out of him, full and genuine, the laugh of a man who has been too serious for too long and has suddenly remembered that the world is also, sometimes, unexpectedly funny. She stared at him. He got himself back, cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. "What's funny?" "Not funny," he said. "Just—" He shook his head. "You stood there in your house slippers and told Charles Whitman he had a survey error." He looked at her. "I don't think anyone in the history of Holt County has done anything half as effective in house slippers." She looked down at her feet. She had, in fact, forgotten about the slippers entirely. Something happened in her chest. That warm, complicated thing again, but bigger now, less possible to set aside. She looked up. "Go inside," she said. "It's cold." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he was smiling when he said it. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the cold stove and pressed both hands flat against it, the way she had on the very first night, and she let herself feel what she felt without trying to name it or manage it or fold it up small enough to fit in a pocket. It was too big for a pocket. It had always been too big, if she was honest, from the moment she'd stood in this kitchen with her flour sack and her handful of salt, and her whole life stretching out behind her, like proof that she had survived things that should have broken her. She was not broken. She was, in fact, just beginning. Outside, the Montana night held everything in its enormous dark, and the stars burned where they always burned, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. But inside that kitchen, with the stove growing warm under her hands and the smell of rosemary and wood smoke still clinging to the walls, Abigail Carter felt something she had almost stopped believing was still possible for a woman who looked like her, who had lived the life she'd lived, who had arrived at this ranch with nothing but a flour sack and the knowledge of her own endurance. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could say, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Charles Whitman did not come back that night. But he came back 3 days later, and this time he did not come alone. Abigail was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horses. 2 of them, coming up the main road at a pace that meant business rather than courtesy. She straightened up from where she'd been working the soil around the new bean rows, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to look. Whitman rode in front. Behind him came a man she didn't recognize. Younger, thin-faced, with the particular look of someone who handled papers for a living and was proud of it. He was carrying a satchel. She walked around to the front of the house without hurrying. Nathan was already there. He'd come from the barn. She could tell by the way he was still pulling his gloves off, the way his jaw was set from the moment he saw who was riding in. Samuel Brooks materialized from somewhere to Nathan's left, the way Samuel always seemed to materialize when something was about to happen, quiet and steady, and positioned slightly behind Nathan's right shoulder, the way a man stands when he's decided he's backing someone up. Whitman swung down from his horse and looked at Nathan, and then looked at Abigail with an expression that tried to be dismissive, but had the quality of a man who was working harder at it than he should have needed to. "Walker," he said. He did not tip his hat. "Whitman," Nathan said. He did not move forward. The thin-faced man came around and opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers and held them the way lawyers hold papers, like they have weight and consequence, and you should feel both of those things looking at them. "I've had my surveyor go back over the eastern boundary," Whitman said. He was watching Nathan, not Abigail, which was a tactical error she noted without commenting on. "The measurements stand. Your cook was mistaken." Abigail did not say anything. "I've also had my attorney," Whitman gestured at the thin-faced man, "draft a revised offer. Given the current state of the ranch's accounts, we believe this number more accurately reflects—" "Can I see the survey?" she said. Whitman looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "The survey your man redid," she said. "I'd like to see it." The thin-faced attorney looked at Whitman. Whitman looked at Abigail. Something moved behind his eyes. A calculation, and then the decision that followed the calculation, which was to hand over the document, because refusing would look worse than complying. He nodded at the attorney, who handed the survey across. She took it and read it. She took her time. She was aware of everyone watching her. Whitman, the attorney, Nathan, Samuel, Pete Darrow, who had appeared in the barn doorway and was trying to look like he wasn't watching. She did not rush for any of them. She read the survey from top to bottom, and then she looked up. "Your surveyor used the same reference point as the original," she said. "The problem isn't the measurement from that reference point. The problem is the reference point itself. It was placed incorrectly in the first survey, and your man used it again." She held the paper out to Whitman. "The eastern boundary error is still here. Line 9, column 2. The benchmark elevation is off by 4 feet. At the distance they're measuring from, that shifts the boundary line by nearly 30 yards. Nobody said anything. Whitman's jaw tightened. The attorney reached out and took the survey back and looked at line 9, and his expression did something he couldn't quite control. "Where did you learn to read a land survey?" Whitman said. His voice had changed. The confidence was still there, but it was working harder now, the way a fire works harder when the wind pushes against it. "From a man in Ohio, who taught me to read everything carefully," she said. "He said the most expensive mistakes people make are in the details they decide aren't worth checking." She held Whitman's gaze. He was right. Whitman looked at Nathan. "This is your cook talking," he said. "You're going to let your cook—" "Miss Carter manages the finances of this ranch," Nathan said. His voice was flat and final. "She reviews the accounts, she reviews the contracts, she reviews the surveys, apparently." He looked at Whitman with the particular steadiness of a man who has found solid ground after a long time of not having it. "If she says your boundary measurement is wrong, I'd suggest you verify it before you come back here with another offer." Whitman's face went through several things in quick succession. Anger. Then the controlled version of anger that men like him wear in public. Then the calculation again. The reassessment of the situation, the updating of the picture. He looked at Abigail one more time. "You're more than a cook," he said. It was not a compliment, and not exactly an insult. It was the observation of a man recalibrating. "Most people are more than what they're called," she said. Whitman got back on his horse. The attorney scrambled to keep up. They rode back down the main road at a different pace than they'd come, slower, less certain, the horses moving the way horses do when their riders are thinking hard. Samuel let out a long, slow breath beside Nathan. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. Line 9, column 2. Nathan turned and looked at Abigail. She was already walking back to the kitchen garden. "Abigail," he said. She stopped and looked back. "Come eat something," he said. "You've been out here since 6. It was such a plain thing to say after what had just happened. So ordinary and real that she felt it more than she would have felt something dramatic. "In a minute," she said, and went back to her beans. The thing nobody told you about becoming the heart of a place was how much it cost. Not in money. Not in labor, though the labor was considerable, and the days were long, and her hands were rough in ways they hadn't been when she arrived. The cost was the other kind, the kind that came from being fully present in a place, from letting its people matter to you, from the slow accumulation of knowledge about each person's particular weight and particular need, and the responsibility that came with knowing. She knew Samuel Brooks had a cough that had been getting worse for a month and was not saying so to anyone. She'd started putting extra honey in his morning coffee and extra steam in the pot. She left on the back of the stove all day, and she'd mentioned casually to Nathan that Samuel ought to see the doctor in Holt before winter came. Nathan had looked at her with a specific expression that meant he'd both noticed the cough and been hoping it would resolve itself, and he'd gone out to the barn that afternoon and had a conversation with Samuel that she had not witnessed, but whose result was Samuel making a trip to town the following Tuesday and coming back with a bottle of medicine and, she suspected, a moderate amount of embarrassment. She knew Diego and Rafael Reyes were sending more money home than usual because their mother had been sick, which meant they were eating less between supply runs because they were too proud to say so. She'd started making the midday meal bigger and leaving extra bread in the bunkhouse without announcing that was what she was doing, or why. And she'd watched Diego's face one afternoon when he found a full loaf on the table, after a day she knew had been hard, and she'd watched him close his eyes for just a moment before he picked it up. She knew Pete Darrow was teaching himself to read in the bunkhouse at night, going through a worn primer he kept in his coat pocket, mouthing the words when he thought nobody was watching. She'd started leaving newspapers on the kitchen table after she was done with them, set out casually where anyone might pick them up, and she'd noticed Pete finding reasons to come into the kitchen in the evenings and sitting at the end of the table and reading without quite acknowledging that he was doing it. She knew all of this, and she held it carefully, and she made decisions about it quietly, in the way she made all her decisions, without announcement, without expectation of recognition, because she had not come here to be recognized, and the work did not require recognition to be worth doing. What she had not fully accounted for was what would happen to her. It started small. It started the way things start when you're not paying attention to them because you're paying attention to everything else. It started with Nathan Walker sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings. He had always come in for coffee after supper. That had been true from the first week. But in the beginning, he'd brought papers with him, had sat across the room from where she was working, and they'd been in the same space without quite being in it together. Gradually, without either of them deciding it, the distance had shortened. He sat closer to where she worked. He left the papers behind. He talked more, about the ranch, about the livestock, about the things he was trying to figure out about the fall contracts. And then he started asking her things that weren't about the ranch at all. What was Ohio like? He asked one evening, out of nowhere, while she was rolling out pastry dough, and he was sitting across the table with his coffee going cold in front of him. She kept rolling. Greener than this, she said. Smaller somehow, even though it isn't. You can't see as far. Did you like it? She thought about it honestly. I liked parts of it. I liked my mother's kitchen. I liked the way the spring came in. It arrived properly, all at once. Not like here where winter just sort of argues with it for weeks. She paused. I didn't like being someone people thought they'd already figured out. He was quiet for a moment. Did they? Figure you out? They thought they did, she said. That's different. What did they get wrong? She looked up from the dough. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd gotten used to and still found slightly disorienting. The way he watched her like she was something worth understanding rather than something to categorize. They thought being large and plain and unmarried was the whole story, she said. They never looked past the cover of the book. Their loss, he said. Simple, like it was obvious. She looked back at the dough. Tell me about Margaret, she said, because she'd been careful not to ask for weeks, and tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a conversation that had enough room in it for that. He was very still for a moment. You don't have to, she said quickly. I shouldn't have. No, he said. It's... He stopped, tried again. I've been talking about her more lately, to Samuel, a little. It's easier than it used to be. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She was small. That's the first thing people noticed. Small and quick, and she had this way of looking at something like she was already 3 moves ahead of it. He was quiet. She was from Pittsburgh originally. Her father was an engineer. She could read blueprints before she could read novels. When I first brought her out here, she walked through every building on this ranch and told me exactly what was structurally wrong with each one and what it would take to fix it. Something warm moved through Abigail's chest. That must have been something. She fixed most of them herself, he said. Well, directed the fixing. She was... He stopped. When he started again, his voice was different, quieter. She was the most capable person I ever knew, and I spent 3 years after she died acting like capability died with her. Like the ranch had lost the only person who could see clearly. He paused. I was wrong about that. He looked at her when he said it. She knew he meant her, and she held the knowledge of that carefully, the way you hold something you aren't sure yet how to carry. Nathan, she said. I know, he said. I know what you're going to say. You don't. You're going to tell me to be careful, he said. That we work together, that it's complicated. She looked at him steadily. I was going to say that you shouldn't confuse gratitude with something else. People do that when someone helps them out of a hard time. They attach what they're feeling to the person who was there. It's not the same thing. He was quiet for a long moment. What if it's not gratitude? He said. She stood there with her hands on the pastry dough and the lamp burning between them and the whole enormous Montana night pressing against the kitchen walls. Then it would need time, she said finally. To be sure. He nodded. Once. The way he always nodded when he accepted something that cost him something to accept. She turned back to the dough. But her hands were not entirely steady, and she knew he could see that, and she let him see it because she had been honest about everything else in this kitchen, and she was not going to start lying now. The crisis came on a Friday. She had been at Walker Ranch for 6 weeks when Dorothy Caulfield walked into her kitchen. Not the store, not the street, the kitchen. The back door of Walker Ranch House opened without knocking, and Dorothy Caulfield came through it with 2 other women from town. The kind of entrance that was designed to establish immediately who felt they had the right to be where. Abigail was making bread. Her hands were in the dough, and she looked up and she said, with the patience of a woman who has survived everything and intends to survive this too. Mrs. Caulfield. Dorothea Caulfield was in her mid-50s, with the bearing of a woman who had decided early in life that respectability was worth any price, and had been paying that price ever since. She looked at Abigail, and then looked around the kitchen with the specific surveying gaze of a person who is looking for something wrong and is confident of finding it. I'm going to be direct, Dorothea said. I'd prefer it, Abigail said. She kept working the dough. This situation has gone on long enough, you being out here, the way Nathan... Dorothea stopped, chose her words. People are talking. People have been talking since I arrived, Abigail said. I've been cooking regardless. "This isn't about your cooking," Dorothea said sharply. "This is about propriety. This is about what it looks like for a man of Nathan Walker's standing in this community to have a woman like you living on his property and having influence over his decisions." One of the women behind Dorothea shifted uncomfortably. The other one was watching Abigail with the fixed attention of someone at a prize fight. "A woman like me," Abigail said. Dorothea's chin went up slightly. "You know what I mean." "I want to hear you say it," Abigail said. Her hands were still in the dough. Her voice was still even. "If you've come into this kitchen to say something to me, Mrs. Caulfield, then say the whole thing." Dorothea's mouth tightened. "You are not the kind of woman Nathan Walker should be associating with, in any capacity beyond what your position requires. You're a cook. You are—" She stopped again. "Fat," Abigail said. "You mean I'm fat and plain, and I have no family name and no husband and no claim to any kind of consideration in your calculation of what Nathan Walker deserves." She pressed the dough firmly with both hands. "Is that what you came here to explain to me?" The kitchen was very quiet. "I came here," Dorothea said, and her voice had shifted, less certain now, the way a prepared speech shifts when the audience doesn't react the way you planned, because someone needed to, because no one else was willing to. "Do you know what I was doing when you came in?" Abigail said. "I was making bread for 7 men who've been working since 5 in the morning. I was doing that after keeping this house running, and those men fed properly, and the accounts organized, and the supply debt reduced by 30% in 6 weeks. She turned and looked at Dorothea Caulfield fully. "Do you know what Charles Whitman's surveyor found when they went back to check the eastern boundary?" Dorothea blinked. "What?" "He found I was right," Abigail said. "The benchmark was off, which means the offer Whitman made was based on fraudulent information, whether deliberately or through incompetence, and the Walker Ranch is worth significantly more than any number he's proposed." She held Dorothea's gaze. "I found that, going through records in the evenings, because this ranch deserves to stand, and I happen to care whether it does." One of the women behind Dorothea, the one who'd been watching like a prize fight, made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Something that was acknowledging something. "Mrs. Caulfield," Abigail said, and her voice was quieter now, not because she was backing down, but because she was finished with the volume part of this. "You don't have to like me. You don't have to approve of me. I have lived my entire life without the approval of women like you, and I have survived it, and I will survive it again." She pulled the dough into a round and covered it with a cloth. "But I would ask you to consider that the thing you came in here to protect Nathan Walker from me, from my influence, from whatever you think is happening in this kitchen, that thing might be the first good thing that's happened to this ranch in 3 years. Dorothea stood very still. "So if you came to warn me off," Abigail said, "you've made your point, and I've made mine. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have bread to finish and a noon meal to start, and those men outside have earned both." She turned back to her bread. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she heard footsteps, retreating, the sound of the back door opening, closing. She kept working the dough. Her jaw was tight, and her shoulders were tight, and there was a shaking somewhere in the back of her hands that she was managing, just barely, through the pressure of the dough against her palms. That was remarkable. She spun around. Nathan Walker was standing in the interior kitchen doorway, the one that led from the kitchen to the main house. He had come in from that direction, not from outside, which meant he had been in the house, which meant he had heard. She stared at him. "How long?" she started. "Long enough," he said. She turned back to her bread. She didn't know what to do with her face, so she put it where he couldn't see it. "You shouldn't have heard that," she said. "I'm glad I did." "Nathan. Abigail." He crossed the kitchen. He didn't stop at the table. He came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the presence of him, and she kept her hands on the bread because her hands needed something to do. "What she said," he said quietly, "about what you are, what you're not." "I've heard it before," she said. "I'll hear it again." "Not from anyone in this county," he said. "Not while I have anything to say about it." She turned and looked at him. He was close, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something open and decided, and past the point of careful management. "You can't protect me from what people think," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can make sure they know what I think." He held her gaze. "And what I think, Abigail, what I have thought for weeks now, longer than I've been ready to say it, is that this ranch is alive again because you're in it. And that has nothing to do with the bread and the accounts and the surveying, though God knows all of that." He stopped. "It has to do with you, specifically, the person you are." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 31 years of rooms where people looked past her. 31 years of being assessed and found wanting before she'd opened her mouth. She thought about the advertisement that had only asked, "Can you feed hardworking people?" and how she'd answered it because it was the first question in 31 years that had been about what she could do instead of what she looked like doing it. She thought about a cold stove and a flour sack with not much left in it. "I need you to be sure," she said. "Not grateful, not relieved, sure." "I have been sure," he said, "for longer than I've been willing to admit to either of us." The kitchen was very quiet around them. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch doing what it did. The men moving, the animals doing their animal business, the particular hum of a working place. The sound of something alive. She looked at Nathan Walker's face, and she let herself see what she'd been carefully not seeing for weeks. The way his eyes found her first when he came into a room. The way his voice changed when he spoke to her versus when he spoke to anyone else. The way he had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to exist in the same spaces she existed in. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right." She turned back to her bread. "Supper is at 6, she said. "And I need you to talk to Samuel about the north fence line today. He mentioned it's been giving trouble, and you've been putting it off." Nathan Walker stood beside her in that kitchen for a moment that was quiet and full and real. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And the way he said it, warm and dry and entirely genuine, made her close her eyes for just a second. She opened them and kept working. But something had settled in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not the answer to everything. Not the resolution of all the years of hard before this. But something solid and particular and true. The kind of thing a person can build on. What happened next came fast, the way the hard things always do, without the decency to announce themselves before they arrived. It was a Saturday evening, and the ranch hands had gone into Holt. Most of them, the ones who went to town on Saturdays, which was most of them. And the ranch was quieter than usual, just Nathan doing paperwork in the main room, and Abigail finishing the kitchen and Eli in the barn, because Eli rarely went to town, a habit she had stopped questioning and started simply accommodating by leaving him something extra in the kitchen when the others were out. She was carrying the bread tins out to the lean-to when she heard Eli's voice from the barn. Not calling out, not alarmed exactly, but strained in a way that stopped her feet. She set the bread tins down and went to the barn. Eli was standing in the middle of the main aisle with his arms crossed over his chest and a look on his face that she had never seen before. Not the quiet, careful look he usually wore, but something younger and more exposed. The look of someone who has been backed into a corner they didn't see coming. Standing across from him were two men she didn't recognize. Ranch hands by their look, but not Walker ranch men. Bigger than Eli. Older. The kind of men who took up more physical space than was strictly necessary. The one in front was saying something to Eli in a low, deliberate way. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, and she caught the way Eli was standing, that particular tension of someone trying to hold their ground and not doing it easily. She walked into the barn. "Eli," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "I need you in the kitchen." All three of them looked at her. The man in front looked her over with the immediate, reflexive assessment she was used to from men like him. She saw him decide, the way Whitman had decided, that she was not a complication worth adjusting for. "This is between us and the boy," he said. "You can wait." "I wasn't asking," she said. She looked at Eli. "Come on." Eli looked at her, and then at the two men, and then at her again, and she could see him calculating something. "What's your business here?" she asked the man in front. Her voice was conversational. She was aware of every physical detail of the situation. The space between her and them, the tools hanging on the wall nearest her, the fact that the barn doors were open behind her. "That's not your concern," the man said. "Everything on this property is my concern," she said. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Nobody sent us." "Then you're trespassing," she said. "And Mr. Walker is in the main house, and I expect he'll have something to say about trespassers when I mention it to him." A beat of silence. "Come on, the second man said to the first quietly. The first man looked at Abigail for a long moment. The calculating look again, more careful this time, reassessing. Then he looked at Eli. "We'll finish this another time," he said to Eli, low, deliberate. They walked out of the barn. She waited until she could hear their horses leaving the yard before she looked at Eli. He was still standing in the same place. His arms were uncrossed now, hanging at his sides, and he looked like someone who had just discovered the ground was steadier than expected after bracing for a fall. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." What did they want? I was quiet for a moment. Then, "They work for a ranch east of here. I was there before Walker Ranch. When I left, it wasn't on the best terms." He paused. "The owner. He thought I'd taken something when I left. I hadn't. But he thinks I did." She looked at him. "Did you go to your employer?" she asked. "About this?" "No, ma'am." "Why not?" He looked at the barn floor. "Because I didn't want to be trouble," he said. "I didn't want Mr. Walker to think I'd brought trouble here." She crossed the barn floor and stood in front of him, and she waited until he looked up. "You listen to me," she said. "You are not trouble. Someone treating you unjustly and following you here to continue treating you unjustly, that's trouble. That belongs to them, not to you. Do you understand the difference?" He looked at her. "Yes, ma'am. Nathan needs to know about this tonight," she said. "And you're going to tell him yourself, because it's your story, and you should be the one to tell it. And he is going to listen." She held his gaze. "Because that is the kind of man he is, and because this ranch is a place where people belong, and belonging means you don't hide when something's wrong." Eli Turner was very still. That wave moved through his eyes again, the one she'd seen before, when she'd said she cooked like she never wanted anyone to feel like there wasn't enough. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, a particular kind of solidity. They went to the house together. She waited in the kitchen doorway while Eli went to find Nathan. She heard their voices from the main room. Eli's, careful and low, telling it, and Nathan's, asking questions. The way Nathan always asked questions when he was taking something seriously, short and direct, no wasted words. She heard Nathan say, "I know the man. He's been dishonest in his dealings before. This won't go further." She heard Eli say, "I didn't want to bring it here." She heard Nathan say, "You didn't bring it. It followed you. There's a difference. And you're not leaving this ranch because of it." She turned back to the kitchen. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the doorway and held it there for a moment, feeling the solid wood under her palm. This house that had been cold and quiet and half abandoned when she arrived and was none of those things now. The bread tins were still in the lean-to. She went and got them. She brought them back and stacked them properly on the shelf she'd organized in the first week. Outside, the evening was coming down soft and gold over the Montana Valley. And somewhere in the main room of this house, a 17-year-old boy with no family and nowhere he'd ever fully belonged was being told that he was not leaving. That the trouble was not his. That this was his place. She thought about flour and salt and a cold stove. She thought about what you could make when you refused to believe that what you had wasn't enough. She put the kettle on for coffee and started the biscuits for the morning and let the kitchen hold her the way it always held her now. Like something that knew her. Like something that had been waiting for exactly who she was. The letter from Charles Whitman arrived on a Monday morning, 3 days after his men had come to the barn. Abigail found it on the kitchen table when she came down at 5, which meant Nathan had already been up and had seen it and had left it there. Not in his office, not in his room, but on the kitchen table. which was where the two of them had been making every important decision for the past 6 weeks. She understood the placement of it the way she understood most of Nathan's wordless communications by now, as a statement of something he didn't yet have the language for. She put the kettle on, and then she picked up the letter and read it. It was formal. Whitman's attorney had drafted it, and you could feel the attorney's hand in every sentence. Careful, lawyered, precise in the way that legal language is precise when it is trying to sound final. The substance of it was this. Whitman had retained an independent surveyor. The independent surveyor had confirmed a discrepancy in the boundary measurement. Whitman was withdrawing his previous offer and reserving the right to pursue a legal remedy regarding the original survey, which had been filed with the county clerk under Nathan Walker's name, and which therefore represented, in Whitman's reading, a misrepresentation of the property's actual acreage. I was trying to flip it. The error that Abigail had found. The error that proved his offer was based on fraudulent information. He was trying to reframe as Nathan's misrepresentation rather than his own surveyor's incompetence. She set the letter down on the table and stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the wood. This was not panic. She had been in situations that felt like no ground before, and she had found the ground every time. But this was serious in a way that required clear thinking from the first moment, and she gave it that. Stood there in the quiet kitchen, with the kettle beginning to sing, and the dawn coming gray and cold through the window, and she thought it through. Nathan came in 20 minutes later. He came in the way he came in when he'd been up for hours and was running on something harder than sleep. Steady, quiet, his jaw set in that particular way. He looked at the letter on the table. "You read it," he said. "Yes." He pulled out the chair and sat down. "He's saying I misrepresented the property. He's saying that because it's the only move he has left," she said. "He knows the boundary error is real. If he acknowledged it, his offer falls apart, and he has nothing. So he's trying to make it your problem instead of his." "Can he?" She sat down across from him. "Not if the original survey shows clearly that the benchmark error was his surveyor's, not yours. Who commissioned the first survey?" "Whitman did," Nathan said. 2 years ago, when he started making noise about buying." She looked at him. "He commissioned the survey?" "He offered to have it done," Nathan said slowly. "As part of the preliminary negotiations. I let him because it was his money and it needed doing." He paused. "I signed the filing because my name is on the deed, but the survey itself, his man did it." Abigail was very still. "So the survey that's filed under your name," she said carefully, "was conducted by his surveyor, with his equipment, using a benchmark that his man placed." "Yes." She picked up the letter again. "Read the relevant paragraph a second time." Then she set it down and looked at Nathan Walker with the particular expression of someone who has just found something valuable in a very unlikely place. "He's not threatening you," she said. "He's panicking." Nathan looked at her. If his surveyor placed the benchmark, and his surveyor got it wrong, and he commissioned the survey himself, the misrepresentation flows back to him, not to you. He knows that. His attorney knows that. She tapped the letter. "This is a bluff. It's a very expensive-looking bluff because he had a good attorney write it, but it's a bluff." She paused. "He's hoping you'll get scared and take whatever he offers next to make it go away." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "How do I prove his surveyor placed the benchmark?" he said. "Who else was there when the survey was done?" she asked. He thought. "Samuel," he said slowly. "Samuel was with me the whole day, and Pete Darrow. They were both there." "2 witnesses," she said. "Who saw Whitman's man place the equipment?" "Abigail, you need to go to Holt today," she said. "You need to see Eleanor Voss's husband at the bank. Not for money, for the name of a good land attorney. Someone out of Billings if there's nobody local you trust. And you need to do it today, not tomorrow, because the moment Whitman sees you, haven't responded to this letter by the end of the week, he'll take the silence for weakness." Nathan looked at her across the kitchen table in the early morning light. There was something in his face that had been building for weeks and was very close to the surface now, something that made her hold her breath without meaning to. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "To Holt? To the bank? To the attorney? Whoever Voss recommends. He held her gaze. I want you there. You understand the numbers better than I do, and you'll hear something I miss. You always do. He paused. And because I want you there. Not just for the practical. He stopped himself. I want you beside me when I walk into that room. She looked at him for a moment that stretched out long and quiet between them. All right, she said. She left the bread dough rising on the counter with a note for Eli, who had started taking on small kitchen responsibilities without being asked. In the quiet way, he took on everything. She pulled on her good coat, the one she'd saved for occasions that merited it, and she climbed up on the wagon bench beside Nathan, and they drove to Holt in the early morning with the mountains cold and enormous on the horizon and the valley still. Neither of them spoke much on the ride in, but about halfway there, Nathan reached across the bench and put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. His hand was warm and certain, and it covered hers completely, and she looked down at it and then looked at the road ahead, and neither of them said a word. And it was one of the most complete conversations she had ever had. James Voss was a careful man with a careful face, the kind of man who had made a career of not reacting visibly to things that surprised him. He read Whitman's letter with the particular stillness of a banker reading something that requires assessment before response, and then he set it on his desk and looked at Nathan and then at Abigail. Who identified the survey error? He asked. Miss Carter, Nathan said. Voss looked at her. What's your background, Miss Carter? Practical, she said. I've been managing the ranch accounts for 6 weeks, and I went through everything, including the filed documents. Did you have formal training in surveying? No, she said. But I know how to read a document, and I know when a number doesn't add up. The benchmark elevation was in the survey notes. The error was visible to anyone who checked the downstream calculations. She paused. Whitman's attorney checked them. That's why this letter says what it says, instead of saying nothing. Voss almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He sent them to a man named Garrett, who had practiced land law out of a back office on Holt's Main Street for 22 years, and who had the look of someone who had seen every kind of dispute a piece of Montana land could generate, and had stopped being surprised by any of them. Garrett read the letter in 2 minutes flat, and then looked up. Who commissioned the original survey? Was his first question. Whitman, Nathan said. Can you prove it? 2 witnesses, Abigail said. Present the full day the survey was conducted. Garrett looked at her with the same assessing look Voss had used. Then he looked back at Nathan. Your cook? He said. Nathan paused. Something moved across his face. Miss Carter manages the operations of the ranch, he said. It was said with a quietness and a precision that made it mean more than the words themselves. Garrett looked between them and made a decision about what he was seeing, and then he looked back at the letter. Write to Whitman's attorney, he said. I'll draft it. We establish the survey chain, his commissioning, his surveyor, his equipment, his benchmark. We note the availability of witnesses. We suggest that any further legal action would require a full accounting of the survey process, including the original correspondence commissioning it. He set the letter down. Whitman's a businessman. He runs the numbers. When the cost of pursuing this exceeds the value of the land, he'll find something else to pursue. How long? Nathan asked. A month, Garrett said. Maybe less. On the ride home, the morning had come fully, and the valley was bright, and the mountains had taken on the particular clarity they get on cold, sunny days, every line of them sharp against the blue sky, the kind of view that made you understand why people fought over this land. Nathan drove. Abigail sat beside him. After a while she said, He's going to go away. Garrett thinks so. Garrett's right, she said. Whitman picked you because he thought you were the easiest target in this county. A grieving man running a struggling ranch with no one in his corner to look at the details. She paused. He miscalculated. He did, Nathan said. He looked at her sideways. And then he said, without preamble, without the careful management she'd grown accustomed to, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing changes. The position is yours as long as you want it. The ranch is... He stopped. What I'm going to say has nothing to do with any of that. I need you to understand that first." She looked at him. "I understand." He kept his eyes on the road. His hands on the reins were steady. "I have been in love exactly once in my life," he said. "And I told myself when I lost her that I understood what I'd had, and I didn't expect to find it again, and I was at peace with that." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about what I had, about whether it could exist again." The wagon moved through the bright morning. "Nathan," she said quietly. "I'm not finished," he said. "I want to say it properly because you deserve to have it said properly, not just implied." He took a breath. "You came here with a flour sack, and you have built something in 6 weeks that I could not build in 3 years. Not because you're useful, though you are, extraordinarily, but because you are who you are. The way you see people. The way you see what's needed before anyone said it. The way you stand in a room and make it feel like it matters that you're there." He paused. "You matter. To this ranch. To every person on it. And to me. Specifically to me. In a way that has nothing to do with bread or accounts or survey errors." He finally looked at her. She looked back at him. She had spent 31 years being told who she was by people who had decided before they looked. She had spent 31 years building things out of nothing. Meals out of empty shelves. Warmth out of cold rooms. Dignity out of situations designed to take it from her. She had done all of that alone, and she had been good at it, and she had never believed, had trained herself not to believe, that there was a specific person in the world who would look at all of it and say, "That is exactly who I want beside me." "I'm not Margaret," she said. Her voice was steady. "I will never be her, and I won't try to be, and you need to make sure you're not looking for her in me." "I know who you are," he said. "I am looking at who you are." She held his gaze for a long time. "Then yes," she said. The wagon went on through the Montana morning, and neither of them said anything more, and it was enough. What happened in the months that followed happened the way good things happen when they're built on solid ground. Gradually, visibly, with the kind of permanence that comes from real foundations. Whitman's attorney received Garrett's letter at the end of October. By the second week of November, a response came back. Terse, carefully worded, walking back the legal threat with the particular language of men who are retreating but don't want to look like they're retreating. By December, Charles Whitman had redirected his interest to a ranch in the next county, and his name stopped coming up in conversation in Holt, the way names stop coming up when they've stopped being relevant. The supply debt was cleared by November. Abigail had restructured the purchasing schedule and negotiated new terms with Caulfield, not through Dorothea, who remained cool, but through Caulfield himself, who turned out to be a reasonable man when his wife wasn't in the room, and who respected a well-organized account ledger with the sincere appreciation of someone who saw very few of them. The kitchen garden had produced more than she'd projected for its first partial season, enough to make a real difference in the food cost, and enough to show what it would do when it had a full year. She'd already planned the expansion. She'd drawn it out on paper on a quiet Sunday evening with Nathan sitting across from her, asking questions about what she was putting where and why, genuinely curious, learning the kitchen logic the way she'd been learning the ranch logic. They had learned each other, in those months, with the careful thoroughness of two people who had both been hurt by the carelessness of others and had decided not to rush the things that mattered. They talked in the evenings. They disagreed about the South Pasture rotation, about whether Pete Darrow was ready for more responsibility, about how to handle a particular ranch hand who had developed a habit of cutting corners on the late work. She was right more often than she expected and wrong more often than she liked, and both of those things were fine. She was fine. She was, in fact, more than fine. She was something she hadn't been in so long she'd almost stopped believing in it as a possible state for a person like her. She was at home. Samuel Brooks's cough had cleared up entirely with the medicine and the honey and the steam and the steady heat of a kitchen that was always running. He had come to her one morning in November and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Miss Carter, I don't know what you did, but I haven't breathed this easy in 2 years." She had told him to sit down and have his coffee and stop making a fuss, and she had turned away before he could see her face. The Reyes brothers had stopped going short between supply runs. She'd never made a point of it, and neither had they. But Diego had started leaving firewood stacked outside the kitchen door every morning without being asked, and Raphael had fixed the lean-to latch that had been broken since before she arrived. And those were the kinds of conversations that happened without words between people who understood each other. Pete Darrow had worked his way through both newspapers she'd left on the kitchen table, and had, with the particular courage of someone who has decided the risk is worth it, asked her one evening whether she had anything else he could read. She'd sent Nathan to Holt the next week with a specific list that included 2 books, and she'd set them on the kitchen table without comment. And Pete had come in and seen them, and gone very still in the way people do when they receive something they didn't believe they were allowed to want. And Eli Turner. Eli Turner had become, quietly and without announcement, something that felt to Abigail like family. Not the family she'd been born into, which had been loving but small and brief. The kind of family you choose when you're old enough to understand what you need. How was in the kitchen every morning before the others came in. Not because she'd asked him, but because he'd started finding reasons to be there. Questions about what she was making. Small tasks he'd taught himself to do without being shown. The habit of presence that develops between people when they have recognized something essential in each other. One morning in late November, very early, she was making pies for the Thursday meal. A proper apple pie, from the root cellar apples she'd been carefully rationing. And a second one because there were enough apples, and because a table with 2 pies on it is better than a table with 1. And Eli came in before sunrise and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Can I learn how to do that?" She looked at him. "Make pie? Make?" He stopped. "Make any of it," he said. "I want to know how to do what you do. Not just pie. All of it. The bread and the stew and all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Get the flour," she said. He came into the kitchen and she taught him. Not just that morning. That morning was the first of many, the beginning of something that became as regular as the sunrise and as necessary. She taught him how to work bread dough by feel rather than by measurement. She taught him the difference between a simmer and a boil and why it mattered. She taught him how to read what a kitchen had and figure out what it could make, how to look at an empty shelf and see the meal that was possible rather than the meal that wasn't. She taught him the thing she'd never been taught explicitly but had always known, that feeding people is an act of love, and that doing it well is a form of dignity, both yours and theirs, and that a person who can walk into any kitchen and make something good from whatever is there will never be entirely without power in this world. Eli Turner learned fast. Eli Turner, it turned out, had the same quality she had: the attention, the care, the ability to hold many things in mind at once and keep them all moving in the right direction. She recognized it in him the way you recognize something in the person you are teaching that mirrors the person you were when you were learning. On a Saturday in December, the first real cold of the season coming hard off the mountains, Eli made the midday meal himself from start to finish while she sat at the kitchen table and watched. He made the stew. He made the biscuits. He cooked the apples down first before he put them in the batter, the way she'd done it, the way his mother had done it. When he set it on this table, and the men came in, and Samuel Brooks looked at the stew, and then at Eli and said, "Turner, did you make this?" Eli looked back at him with a steadiness that was new and real and hard-won. "Yes, sir," he said. Samuel tasted it. He set his spoon down. He picked it up again. He looked at Abigail at the end of the table. "Lord," he said, "there's 2 of you now." The table laughed, and Eli laughed with them, and Abigail sat at the end of that table in the warmth of that kitchen with the cold outside, and the people she had somehow, in 6 months, made into a family around her, and she felt something she was going to allow herself to call happiness. Not the fragile kind. Not the kind that depends on everything going right, and nobody saying the wrong thing, and the world behaving itself. The solid kind. The kind that lives in the bones rather than on the surface, that doesn't disappear when hard things happen because it's not made of circumstances. It's made of the people you chose and the work you did and the knowledge that you met this life fully and honestly and gave it everything you had. The evening it became real, completely, publicly, undeniably real, was the night of the first snow of the season. Nathan had asked her, on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table, with the particular quiet seriousness that she had learned meant he had been thinking about something for a long time, and had finally decided to say it. "I'd like to talk to you about something that isn't the ranch." She'd looked at him. "I think you know what I'm going to say," he said. "Say it anyway," she said. "You told me once that I deserved to have things said properly." He had looked at her with something in his face that was so open and so certain that it was almost hard to look at directly, the way some things are. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. Not as the person who runs the accounts and reads the surveys and fixes everything I've been letting fall apart. I want you to stay as—" He paused. "I want to marry you, Abigail. If you'll have me. I want you here because you want to be here, not because it's the position you answered an advertisement for." She had been still for a long moment. She had thought about what it meant. Not just what it meant for her, but all of it. The town. Dorothea Caulfield. The looks on the main street. The way people had been watching and assessing and deciding since the day she arrived. She had thought about all of it, and she had understood clearly that none of it was going to stop. That being Nathan Walker's wife would add new versions of it even as it answered some of the old ones. That there was no version of her life in which the world was going to fully let her be. And then she had thought about 31 years. 31 years of flour sacks and cold stoves and empty kitchens and rooms where she had been looked past. 31 years of making enough out of not enough. Of building warmth where there was none. Of doing the work fully and quietly and completely, and being worth every bit of it, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And she had looked at Nathan Walker, this man who had seen her. Not the version of her that was easy to dismiss. Not the version that could be summarized in 3 seconds by a glance. The whole version. The real one. "Yes," she had said. The snow came that night. She woke to it in the morning. The particular silence of a landscape under new snow, the way the world sounds when it's been covered in something clean. She got up. She built the fire. She started the bread. When Nathan came in, the kitchen was warm, and the smell of fresh bread was already moving through the house, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood the very first night, taking in the room, the light, the woman at the stove. And then he came in and poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table, and watched her work. "Snow," he said. "I know," she said. "Lot of it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The men are going to need a bigger breakfast. Already planned for it," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen. She looked back at him, and between them was something that had been built not in a single moment, but in hundreds of them. In cold mornings and long evenings and difficult conversations and account books and survey errors and apple cakes and 17-year-old boys who needed to be told they belonged somewhere. She turned back to the bread. She heard his chair scrape back. She heard his footsteps cross the kitchen. She felt him stop behind her, close, and then his hands settled on her shoulders. Warm, steady. The hands of a man who had decided and was not going back from it. "Abigail," he said. "The bread needs another minute," she said. He laughed, quietly, completely, the real kind. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head and went to sit back down, and she stood at the stove with her hands on the bread dough and her eyes bright and the fire warm against her face. 6 months ago she had walked into this kitchen with a flour sack and a handful of salt and 7 hungry men outside the door, and not a single person in the world who believed she could do what she said she could do. She had lit the stove. She had made the bread. She had fed the people. And then she had kept going. Through the empty shelves and the cold rooms and the silent man and the cruel town and the bullying businessman, and every version of the world that had spent her entire life insisting she was less than she was. She had kept going with her hands and her mind and her will and her extraordinary, ordinary, irreducible self. The meal she had cooked that first night was still talked about in Holt, Montana, not because the food itself was anything the territory hadn't tasted before, but because of what it meant. Because of what it proved. Because a woman who had arrived with nothing had sat down at an empty table and decided it was worth setting. Walker Ranch did not become the largest ranch in Montana. It did not become famous or rich or spoken of in newspapers. It became something better than all of those things. It became a place where people belonged, where a boy with no family found a kitchen and a purpose, and a woman who taught him that feeding people was its own form of love, where a man who had stopped living found his way back to it, where a group of hard-working men who had been fed like livestock started eating like people who mattered, because they did matter, and because someone had been willing to say so with every meal, every morning, without fail. And at the center of all of it, in the warm kitchen with the iron stove and the root cellar and the garden, she was already planning to expand, and the account books she kept in neat columns and the bread that came out of the oven every morning like a promise that was always kept, was Abigail Carter. Large and plain and unmarried no longer, but exactly herself in every way that had always mattered. Every way the world had spent decades trying to convince her didn't count. It counted. Every bit of it counted. And the woman who had arrived at Walker Ranch with nothing but flour and a cold stove had proved, beyond any argument, that when you begin with everything you truly are, when you refuse to be less than yourself in the face of every force that insists you should be, you have enough. You have always had enough.